Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Well, hello, Karen.
Daylight savings time is upon us.
And apparently it's affecting the way we start our show. No, it's daylight savings time. Big influence on people, very little influence on plants. But I guess you can make the argument.
Well, the light change has an influence on plants.
Well, the light changing, but that has nothing to do with daylight savings.
That's true.
But I guess the input that we do on agriculture is influenced by daylight savings because, like, I'm thinking about this, right? Last week, I'm getting up, I go to the greenhouse to do some things, and it's dark. Don't have the lights up yet, so it's harder to work. But now, I should be able to get out there with a little bit of light before I go to work and, water some things, check on some things, whatever. But after work, it's going to be darker. So, it's kind of, I think it'll influence my management, but it really won't influence my plants as far as they see the light.
Right. And, there are some plants that like light and some plants that don't. So if you're, say, working with poinsettias and you want them to, change colors and you go out early in the morning and turn on a light to start working in the high tunnel, that's going to change your plant's view of how long the day is.
That's right. So what we're talking about there is duration. And we could talk about different aspects of light that influence plant growth. When we talk about the quality of light, we're really talking about the energy spectrum. So, when we talk about light is energy, and then you have the spectrum of visible light. And within that spectrum, you have higher energy and lower energy. You have certain wavelengths that influence photosynthesis, and then other wavelengths that do other things. And we could talk about that as we go on with the show. But so there's quality, and that's the energy spectrum. That's blue to red. That's like the wavelength sizes between energy waves. Yeah, had to think about that. There's duration. So then there's the amount of exposure. So that's what we're talking about, long days and short days. And obviously, as we in the northern hemisphere, as you go into winter, your days get shorter and your nights get longer. And then there's intensity, and that's the number of photons. And that's kind of like dim lights versus bright light. So that's just another aspect of energy. So plants, they're influenced by all the factors, quality, duration, and intensity for optimal growth. And they all influence the way they grow. And some of them like some things better than others.
Right. And there is a term associated with light that you may have seen if you have a high tunnel called PAR. And that stands for photosynthetically active radiation, which is the wavelengths that plants use to do photosynthesis. And so the thickness of the plastic and the transparency of the plastic is going to influence that PAR value. And so that's what that means. It's the photosynthetically active radiation, or the spectrum of light that the plants use for photosynthesis.
Yeah, so that's stuff like quality. So when you think about it, higher energies like in the blues, plants can photosynthesize in the blues and they can photosynthesize in the reds. And then when we talk about different mediums, energy passes through things like, we could talk about radio waves being part of a quality of energy that's very long wavelengths, and radio waves can go through many things. So same thing with light. The higher energies in the blues tend to be absorbed by leaves, canopies, and then you got the reds that are also useful for photosynthesis. But then you have something called far red, which is kind of like the transition from red light to infrared, which is heat. And then as you go into the longer wavelengths, they kind of pass through things. And then when you have something like plastics, thicker plastics tend to absorb higher energy light. And then what ends up happening is the plant that's under it almost seems like it's underneath a canopy, because you're going to have the longer wavelengths coming through and a higher intensity. And that can influence the hypocaudal length, so the distance between the nodes even. So you'll get like a longer, like a taller plant.
A leggy plant.
The plant's typically weaker.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get a darker plant because the plant's trying to make more chlorophyll to absorb anything.
And thicker leaves usually too.
But it does influence the way it grows. And usually if you're trying to get fruit, like berries, we could talk about tomatoes, fruit trees, even though you don't really do those in high tunnels, but tomatoes, for instance, they do require a lot of energy input for the sugars to be made. So that will have an effect on it because it's just the quality of the energy is shifted.
Right. And so, you think about why or how do you use this information when you're looking at maybe putting up a high tunnel or putting new plastic on your high tunnel. You think about that intensity of light and how it's impacted by that particular plastic. So if you have a single layer of plastic, you might get 88 to 92% of that PAR, but a double layer is going to decrease that to maybe 77 to 85%. And so if you think about that amount of light that's getting through the plastic, if there's not a lot of light coming through, that plastic's going to decrease it even more. So that's going to help you make that decision as to whether or not you want to go with the single ply or the double ply. But also keeping in mind, if you have a greenhouse or a high tunnel, there's going to be condensation inside of it, right? Because your humidity level is usually much higher inside. And one of the reasons you go for that double poly is to reduce that condensation issue, because that condensation itself is also going to diffuse some of that light and decrease the amount of light that's going to get down to your plants. So keep that in mind when you're making those decisions. You want to think about where you are. Do you get a lot of winter light? Do you get a little winter light? And you're going to use that also to direct your high tunnels. So if you're more northern, you want to have the longest angle of light hitting your plants as possible so that you can not only have that intensity, but also have the length. And so you want your high tunnel oriented east-west so that it'll get more light in the wintertime when you're trying to grow those cool season crops. So when you have your high tunnel with the long side facing south, it's going to let in more light later in the year when our days are shorter. In the summertime, you're still going to have that south-facing side. So you do want to think about how that's going to affect. And if you are using your tunnel for summertime production, you'll want to look into shade cloth as well, because there is such a thing as too much light. But don't forget about accidental shading too. Like we talked about shade cloth, which is a great way to reduce the light intensity inside of a tunnel in the summertime or when your day lengths are really long and bright. But you can accidentally shade crops simply by putting them in the wrong location. Like, for instance, let's say you're growing tall crops like kale. They're going to be grown all winter. And let's say you put them right on your outer edges, and then you have your shorter growing crops like a lettuce growing in the center. That kale can actually get tall enough that it's going to block all of the sun from getting inside your tunnel, depending on what angle the sun is coming in at. So when you're looking at those lower angles with your winter sunlight, then you want to put your taller crops towards the north so that the shorter crops can absorb that sun coming in on that south edge before it gets to those taller crops, which will still have enough leaf area to capture those sun rays.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And so, let's look at where we are, Karen. We're about 40 degrees latitude, okay? So in March and September, we're about 12 and 12, just like in the equator, 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark. So for us, our longest days fall between March and September. So between March and September, the days are longer than the nights. And then once you get into September to March, so now, right? So we're in October. No, we're in November now. Man, what am I talking about?
Yeah, it's November,
dude. It is November. And in November, in Ohio here at 40 degrees, in November, we are about, let me calculate this here. 16 hours of dark and 8 hours of light, So here's the good thing. So when we look at the duration, if you're doing something like lettuce, right? Lettuce responds to day length, so the duration of light. If lettuce has days that are 12 hours or longer, it likes to bolt. When it's the opposite, so like where we are now, where we have 16 hours of darkness and about 8 hours of light, and I'm rough estimation, it's probably a little less than that. Lettuce will stay more vegetative. So as far as the light duration conditions for leafy vegetable productions, winter is ideal, summer is not.
Right.
And you can manipulate that. You talk about shade cloths and stuff like that. So shade cloth is a great way to manipulate that quality of light. So you have the longer wavelengths coming through, which mimics darkness for plant receptors. So that is another way to do it. But, on the positive side, if you're doing leafy vegetables, those shorter days, longer nights are going to keep things more vegetative. So you should technically, if you have some really good ag practices in your high tunnels or greenhouse in the wintertime, and you're able to maintain a decent temperature for growth, your light quality as far as the duration is good, but then you're going to need some intensity, because even though lettuce is nice to grow under lower light conditions, there is a threshold where you're too low and it's not going to do anything.
Right. Like, for instance, if you're trying to manage your temperature by using row cover inside your high tunnel, that's going to reduce your light even more, because row covers that contain heat, well, they also block the light. And so the thicker your row cover, the more heat it maintains, but also the more light it blocks out. So it's really important to keep all of those things into consideration. And so perhaps if you have a nicer day, it's above 20, you want to take that row cover off so your plants can get that more intense light on them, and then just put it back on overnight whenever the temperatures start dropping again. Always keeping in mind, of course, that when you're covering a plant, you need to capture the heat of the day in the soil. That's how you're keeping them warm. And so if you go out at 9 o'clock at night to put your row cover on, it's going to be a lot less effective than if you go out at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon to put the row cover on.
Here's another interesting little tidbit. Not so much for high tunnels, but if in a greenhouse setting where you want to put artificial lighting to increase that intensity, to be able to manipulate duration as you wish, and you can even manipulate the quality depending on your bulb. So if you think about like those older bulbs, right? The ones that we say were really, really energy inefficient.
Oh yeah.
and they're also called incandescent lights. So incandescent lights, like the real inefficient ones, right? If you remember, like they tended to heat up, right? They got really hot. So if you have an incandescent light and you look at the quality, so you're looking at the type of energy that's coming through, it's really low in the blues and it's very high in the reds. And the reason it gets hot is because it's even higher in the infrared. So it pumps out a lot of heat, pumps out a lot of red. And if you're looking at those cooler lights, when we talk about fluorescent bulbs, they don't get hot and they actually have much higher blues than they do the reds. Even though blue and red are both photosynthetic energies, the plant can use both blue or red for photosynthesis. But what we find is if you have more blues and that quality of light that you're giving a plant, they kind of stay vegetative more. So if you're trying to get something to flower, you want something that's a little bit more in the red spectrum than in the blue spectrum. And they make grow bulbs. They got this stuff down to a science. But if you're doing stuff like lettuce and cool season vegetables that you want to keep vegetative and not go into reproductive mode, then those blue fluorescent bulbs work great.
Right. And you have to think about, what is your overall goal here? Are you trying to add some heat to your greenhouse by using the incandescent bulbs? Adding a couple incandescent bulbs for heat will also increase that ultraviolet, but for the most part, that's not really what your goal is in a greenhouse environment. And a lot of the newer bulbs, the LED bulbs, have actually been shown, especially if you get the red and blue ones that make that purpley glow. Those are really great for leafy green production because they don't get hot, they don't use a lot of energy, and you can put them on a timer just like any other light, but they have been shown through research to be very effective in indoor food production. In fact, when you look at those mega production facilities that are in these giant warehouses, those are the lights they use. They don't have regular lighting in there. They all have those red and blue LED lights so that they can use less energy to produce those indoor crops.
That's right. And it's the exact quality that the plant uses for photosynthesis. So you're not really wasting energy making those other wavelengths that the plants aren't responding to that much. There is some response, but I know from a production standpoint, red and blue are the money makers, we'll say, right?
Indeed. Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about light intensity for a minute. And light intensity, it can be measured in a variety of ways, but I like this chart that's actually measured in foot candles or lux, which apparently are interchangeable. But we can compare them qualitatively to one another. So, for instance, if you're looking inside your house, right? So, home interior, the light intensity in terms of foot candles ranges from 50 to 300. In a heavy overcast day, it'll range from, so this is like where nothing but clouds, right? So there is no sun. So you're like, okay, nothing's happening. But the range in foot candles for light intensity outside is 500 to 1,000. So even on the cloudiest days, it just towers over a well-lit home. On a bright overcast day, you got anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000. And if we're talking full sun, the middle of the summer, no clouds in sight, it can be as high as 12,000 foot candles. So, when you're thinking about how much is being filtered, especially, if we're talking about from indoors to outdoors, it can be a huge difference. And usually when we talk about this stuff, we're talking about early in the spring, you're trying to get a head start on things. So you start germinating things indoors, and then you slowly transition them to higher intensities of light to be able to put them out in full sun for optimum production. But you got to do it slowly.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really important to understand that things aren't going to grow as fast typically when you're not able to provide that intensity of light. So if you're not doing any artificial lighting, and one, you're going into winter where the sun is further away, doesn't go as high, you typically have more clouds. We used to say that like you don't really see the sun from November until February, well, until March, because it doesn't come out very long because the nights are so long, but you also have a lot of cloud cover. And then you put another structure on top of that, it really starts filtering down the light. So what you might find is if you're not adding any artificial lighting, then your growth rate is going to be vastly different in that kind of situation. So people that really want to optimize their production in the wintertime and greenhouses, high tunnels you typically don't run a lot of electricity into, but that artificial lighting is really crucial for the production rate of crops, whether it's tomatoes or whether it's lettuce. And with lettuce and leafy vegetables, typically you're going to use less light because you're eating the leaves as opposed to the fruit.
Right. And that's one of the reasons we typically grow what we call cool season crops in high tunnels in the wintertime, because they don't need as much light. And when you're looking at things like tomatoes and strawberries, they really need the warmth and the light intensity and day length to develop all of the sugars that go into those fruits. And a lot of times, like if you're trying to grow strawberries in a high tunnel in the winter without supplemental lighting and maybe even a little supplemental heat, then you're going to have some pretty sour strawberries because the plants just can't develop enough sugars to really fill out those fruits. You may get some fruit, but it's not going to taste great.
Yeah, and when we look at the physiology of the actual leaf with light intensity, it's really interesting. What ends up happening is when you have the lower energy intensities, you typically have a thicker leaf and you have a more pigmented leaf, so a darker green. And what the plant's doing is because there's less photons coming in, it's trying to optimize the ability to capture that energy. So it'll make a thicker leaf so it doesn't go through it. It'll make more chlorophyll, making it darker. And as far as like a leafy vegetable crop goes, that's ideal. So in lower lights, you get a thicker leaf and a greener leaf. When you have very high intense light, what ends up happening is you'll get a thinner leaf because it wants to allow that energy to kind of go through it because it's just saturated. It's too much. So the plant typically has a thinner leaf and it makes less chlorophyll. So it's not as dark. So if you're trying to eat the leaf, a darker, thicker leaf tastes better than a thinner, lighter green leaf. But overall, with the total sugars produced, the light intensity is really what's going to drive that. So you don't want to limit the energy input if you're trying to make sugars to put into a fruit. But if you're eating the leaves, now you can manipulate the physiology of the leaves to taste better. So depending on the crop, really it's going to depend on the intensity of light that you are given that plant. And then the leaves will respond accordingly. And so if you don't care about what the leaf tastes like in a tomato, you're going to give it more energy to be able to maximize that sugar production. But if you're eating that leaf, that vegetative tissue, you do care about how it responds to the light. So in that case, chances are you're going to give it lower energy, darker green, thicker leaf. Like it just tastes better.
And if you want to go out and actually see this in action, a great thing to do is to go into the woods. And here I am talking about trees again. But if you go into the woods, especially in the fall, and the leaves are coming down, and you find a gigantic leaf, like from a sycamore or a poplar, those trees do this really well. You get these really, really big leaves. That tells you that that leaf didn't have a lot of sunlight, and it was working as hard as it could to absorb any photons that kind of filtered down through the canopy. But on that very same tree, all the way up in the top, you're going to have a really small, thin leaf that didn't need to work as hard to get those photons, to get that food from the sun. And so even on one plant, you can have leaves that are a lot bigger and thicker than in another location that got more sun. And so you can actually go out and witness how this works by looking at the leaves falling off of the trees at this time of year. And you can take a big pile of leaves and sort them out by size and go, this pile was at the top of the canopy, this pile was in the middle of the canopy, and this pile was on the base of the canopy, just by looking at the leaf size and thickness.
Well, that sounds like fun. No, no.
Well, if you're a tree dork like I am, it is fun.
No, I'm just teasing you. I was going to make a comment about the leaves are kind of off the tree now, so it's hard to do. But you're right. I guess if you were digging around the piles, you could probably figure it out. And I love it how we went into the woods, but we didn't get lost in the woods.
Thanks.
But you're right. It's just just plant physiology. That's how plants adapt to different light intensities. And I was thinking about this, that's deciduous trees typically. That's like the flat leaf type trees. But if you're thinking of when we're talking about needles, let's not go down that road because it's a lot more complicated. So I just love how there's always exceptions. There's always things that make you wonder what exactly is going on there. But, as far as the evergreens go, you don't typically see too much differences in their chlorophyll content, but I'm sure, if you can look into it, you ask an evergreen expert, they'll probably blow your mind.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's a little more complicated with evergreens, but there are variances for the intensity of light as well with the needles. And a lot of that has to do with what species grows where. But you didn't want to get lost in the woods, so don't send me down a path here.
I know, and I did, didn't I? Yeah, I just
It's
did
totally
that to
on
myself.
you. It's totally on you.
All right, let's go back out of the woods.
But I wanted to call back to something you were talking about earlier. Like you had talked about how the light changes, and it just really made me think about, sitting in my office in the summertime, I never worry about the light coming in through the window. My desk faces south. And so in the summertime, I have the curtains open and I never turn the lights on in my office because it's so bright and cheery. But as we start getting those lower sun rays and they start changing angle, then the light just comes right and shines directly in my face. So then in the wintertime, oddly enough, I'll close the curtains and then I have to turn a light on. And it's all about the angle and the intensity of those sunbeams and how much they change throughout the year.
It is. And honestly, the day length to me is what is really astounding, just how much it changes. And the further north you go, the greater the change. The further south of the equator you go, you get the reciprocal of it.
Yeah, my son keeps telling me he wants to move to Iceland. And I'm like, honey, they don't have a lot of sunlight in the winter there.
They don't. Yeah. Or they have just, in the summertime, it's just nothing but sunlight. The sun never sets. But it's just amazing how the distance from the equator can change the day length so quickly. But I love the name equator, right?
Oh, yeah.
Equator, because days and nights are equal
on both sides.
12 and 12.
Yeah.
All year round. You'll never have a change in day length in the equator. It's interesting.
It is. But before we run out of time, I did want to plug a really great publication. If you are planning on raising cool season vegetables in your high tunnel, Purdue Extension has a great publication from their horticulture and landscape architecture group. And it's called Managing the Environment in High Tunnels for Cool Season Vegetable Production. Once again, it's Purdue Extension and Managing the Environment in High Tunnels for Cool Season Vegetable Production. They go over light intensity, but they also cover heat and airflow, which are two other critical factors for keeping your plants healthy. So I encourage you to check that out. And thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.